So in the talk this afternoon, I would like to continue these reflections on compassion and drawing on both the Buddhist psychology and also contemporary theories about compassion. And I find the interaction and dialogue between them really interesting, really something to explore. And I wanted to begin with something contemporary, which is from Paul Gilbert, who is at Derby University, not so far from where I am here in Nottingham. But he's one of the key researchers on compassion. And he talks of us having three systems. And I found this, again, a very helpful teaching. And these three systems are a threat system. So this is when we notice what's wrong, what's missing, what's not okay. In short, what's threatening, what might be something that really urgently needs our attention that could be harmful for us. So we're in that mode of kind of scanning the world to find out what's wrong, what's not okay, what's threatening. He also talks about us having a drive system. So this is where we are more focused on goals and what we want to achieve, what we want to get, particular outcomes that we have in mind. And then finally, we have a soothing system. So this is really what kicks in when the other two are not activated, when we can feel more calm, more at ease, more restful, more content. And the idea of these three systems is that they're all part of our heritage, if you like. They're all part of our biological heritage. And that, we have them, and that they all are adaptive. They all have a purpose. So it isn't as if our practice were to try to eradicate one or more of those systems and say permanently live in the soothing system. And although the threat system can feel difficult at times, when we're really experiencing states of anxiety or anger or fear, what I like about this perspective is also pointing out that these have important messages for us. Important messages for us. And again, you may have heard this kind of example before, but if you're living in the wild and you think, oh, that might be the sound of a wild animal just in the grass over there. If you are wrong 100 times you think, oh, there might be one there, so you check kind of anxiously, worried about it, or you run away. But the 101st time you were right to do that, then in a way, all those 100 times have been kind of helpful, right? And it's said that our ancestors who would have just sat there and said, actually, it's fine, I'll just watch my breath, there's probably not an animal there at all, everything's okay, are not here to tell the story. Makes sense. So it's an interesting perspective, particularly for those of us trained in the Dharma teachings, to sort of see, if you like, the messages, I like that, in what we sometimes see as our more difficult emotions, or sometimes termed as, negative emotions, or perhaps unwholesome states as well. Sometimes in the Dharma teachings, we have this term. And so it's interesting to see, what's underneath that? What's the message here? But the tricky part for us is that we tend to get stuck in the threat system in particular, perhaps also in the drive system, and the soothing system gets squeezed out. And that's the bit when we feel overwhelmed, stressed, it's too much, our attention narrows, our body is tense, and we lose a sense of well-being, we lose a sense of perspective, we lose a sense of being able to cope. So something that is supposed to be like an emergency system that kicks in from time to time becomes something that's kind of jammed on, and that's more tricky. There's a nice example of these three systems with the example of a cat. I just wanted to share this because it really brings them to life. It says the three basic emotion regulation systems can be easily observed in a cat. If a cat feels secure, she might lie down in the garden and relax in the sun. If there's nothing in particular to be done, her attention wanders unfocused. She may purr when stroked, play with a kitten, or nod off. She is in her soothing system and rests. But if a barking dog suddenly appears, she jumps up with an arched back and fluffed tail, hissing at the intruder. Immediately, her threat system is switched on. Her body is all tense, her attention is narrowly focused on what she doesn't want, which is the offensive dog. She might try to scratch it or run off, depending on its size. When she feels safe again, it doesn't take long until she returns to her soothing system. But now we humans often need longer to return to the soothing system, as we easily start imagining what could have gone wrong or what might go wrong if the dog returns. But the cat is untroubled by this. She relaxes again, and if not sleepy, may play around with open attention for her surroundings. But if the cat feels hungry and sees a mouse, she's suddenly on alert again, and her muscles tense up. Now we recognize the energy of the drive system, which is different from the threat system. She is driven toward the object of her desire, and her attention focuses on what she wants, which is to catch the mouse. If she's successful, she will fill her stomach. She will not be bothered by human thoughts about getting more than she actually needs, and will soon happily surrender to her soothing system again. This is from, if you see, it's a book called A Practical Guide to Mindfulness-Based Compassionate Living, which is one of the courses. I can show you this later if you would like to. So I find this teaching very helpful because a central element of our practice, all of our practice and our compassion practice, can be how do we respond in those times when things feel more difficult? And it's very easy to take our more difficult emotions very personally. And again, the Dharma teachings are really helpful here, aren't they? The teachings of not self. So that shift of perspective from saying, why am I so angry, anxious, tense, or whatever, to see these as patterns that arise in the mind. So they're not substantial things that a self owns, but they are patterns that pass through. A very helpful perspective, because it's when we start to take them personally or see them as some kind of problem, personal flaw, that we can react to them in ways that are not so helpful. And a teaching that I've returned to time and time again, because it's just a beautiful way of remembering what is helpful, is the teaching of rain, taught by many teachers, originally Michelle McDonald and Tara Brach and others now teaching this. But those times of recognizing what's happening when we feel more stirred up, agitated, overwhelmed, that moment of recognition is very significant. You know, before I recognize that there's a sense of irritation present, then I just think that's wrong, that's out of place, and that person shouldn't be doing what they're doing. So I'm seeing the world through the irritation. But recognition allows us to step back, doesn't it? It's like, we begin to be aware of that as a pattern in the heart and mind. We don't need to believe what it tells us. Well, recognition is the opposite of being unaware, isn't it? Very often these states of mind are present, we're not really aware that they're there. So we're driven by them. Recognition, we are aware. And that already is beginning to bring in some choice. The A for rain stands for allow. And again, this goes against our habitual tendency, because our habitual tendency might be to try to get rid of. Yeah. And although I really love the language of the Buddhist psychology when it speaks of wholesome and unwholesome, I really find that a very helpful perspective. But at the same time, it needs, I think, some care, because we can easily see, this is unwholesome. And unless we hold that framework skillfully, it's easy to think, therefore, I need to just immediately get rid of. So we tense around it and try and push it away, or we try to stop having the thoughts that are in our mind by somehow aversively pushing something away. So allow is the opposite of that, isn't it? Can we make space? We can do that in so many ways. I've been using the language today, haven't I, of breathing with, breathing in the midst of. We can use words like this too, this belongs, this is welcome. So we can, make space around for things that we had previously tried to just eradicate and push away. And the I, which stands for investigate, really means to be curious then. Yeah. So rather than being stuck in a perspective, something's happening, I don't like it, I need to get rid of it, we can be curious. What's it like to be anxious? How does that feel right now? What's it like to feel sad? And the curiosity is 90% around noticing how things are in the body. And as I mentioned earlier today, it can be very skillful to use different parts of the body in different ways, to feel the feet, to feel the seat as grounding the attention, to give us sufficient steadiness, to turn towards, maybe the throat or the chest or the belly feels more stirred up. And there's that principle of steadying first, so we can then be curious about what's happening in the body. It makes all the difference to our practice, doesn't it? Like I'm practicing, I've got a bad back. Can't really get on with this today. Yeah. Okay. So there's painful sensations there. What does that feel like? What's it like if I bring my attention there? How does it feel to send the breath to them? What's it like to open my eyes and take in something beautiful? How does that change these sensations in the back? But this curiosity then, whatever's happening in our practice kind of ceases to be a solid sort of problem that we want to get rid of, but something that's leading onwards. And the N of rain stands for, in Tara Brach's version, stands for nurture. So this is again, how can we find a way of being kind to ourselves in the midst of difficult experiences? So again, practically speaking, we may use words, we may use a gesture, we may use images, of a person who embodies that sense of kindness for us. We may use wise activities, do something nourishing. But I honestly feel it's worth, years of reflection, this rain teaching. Maybe one you've heard before or sounds very simple in a way, but actually to live it is really quite something. Because we're moving away from these habitual ways. We're moving away from unawareness to recognition. We're moving away from aversive ways of being with our difficult experiences to allowing them. We're moving away from tuning out to looking more deeply, being curious. And we're tuning away from blaming ourselves for what's going on, or judging ourselves, or deciding it means we're not very spiritual or something like that, to bringing some kindness and care. And I think really when we cultivate this, there is that wonderful possibility of being both the one who is in pain and the one who is soothing that I mentioned earlier. Both the one who's in pain and the one who's soothing. So it's, again, the metaphor here is being able to hold. We can hold more in our own experience. So Tara Brach basically also describes this again using very traditional Buddhist teaching from Milarepa, the Tibetan master. So I shall share this teaching from, this is Milarepa via Tara Brach. So he says, we are often at war with our painful emotions and bad habits, the unwanted shadow parts of ourselves. We try denying them and pushing them away. We try to hide them, fix them, or condemn them. But it's typically a losing fight. Milarepa, a 12th century Tibetan master, found himself in such a battle. After many years of living in solitude, doing practices in his mountain retreat, he returned one evening to find his cave filled with demons. Although he understood that they were just projections of his own mind, that didn't make them any less threatening or horrible. But how was he to get rid of them? First, he thought teaching them spiritual truths might help, but they just ignored him. Angry and frustrated, he ran at them, trying to push them out of the cave. Far stronger than he, they laughed at him. At last, Milarepa gave up, sat down on the floor and said, I'm not leaving, and it looks like you're not either. So let us just live here together. That's how we might finally respond to the especially stubborn demons we live with. Well, that's just the way I am. I guess I have to live with it. That's just the way life is. But to Milarepa's surprise, when he stopped resisting, instead of taking over, all the demons got up and left the cave. All except one. And this one was particularly powerful. Milarepa realized that the only thing he could do was have the courage to deepen his surrender. He walked over to the great demon and placed his head inside its gigantic mouth. Just eat me up if you want to, Milarepa said. At that moment, the demon vanished. And then Tara Brach goes on to say, I've found that it's only when I stop resisting entirely, stop judging, stop trying to control, stop tensing against, stop avoiding, only then do I arrive in an open, tender, and healing presence. Yeah, I think this is a immensely powerful story. Is when we come to our Dharma practice, we may well, or perhaps almost inevitably will, bring the habits of a lifetime to the way in which we see this practice. The habits of thinking, here I am, and I'm trying to somehow fix or improve myself. That's what this practice is about. I'm trying to overcome everything unwholesome. I'm trying to develop everything wholesome. I'm trying to, eradicate the impurities within me. And that view can bring a kind of tight, tough push-pull with all of our experience, a kind of struggle. And I think that story from Milarepa really tells us the opposite, doesn't it? It's like, learning to be with these energies and patterns in a different way is what's freeing, not trying to sort of eradicate them. And that's also where I like this idea of the threat system. When we understand that this is, these patterns can be part of what it is to be human, and they can be protective at times. And if we can see them for what they are, then they come, they arise, they pass through. They're very helpful when there is a genuine emergency, but we don't have to live in them. We don't have to be stuck with them. Yeah. So this way of being with ourselves, being with our difficult emotions, I think is really exemplifying what it means to be compassionate, what it means to find a compassionate relation to ourselves. And this can then really spread out as we view others. How are we with other people? And one reflection I find skillful is to think of compassion as being like the opposite of propaganda. Yeah, the opposite of propaganda. So if you think for a moment what propaganda tries to do, propaganda tries to tell us that there is some other group of people who it is safe to despise. You know, these are the bad people, right? These are the people that we can say, you know, they're the root of all the problem. They're the people who are not like us. They're the people we need to get rid of. They're the people we need to banish. And underneath that, somehow the idea that if only we could get rid of those people, the bad lot over there, whoever they are, everything would be okay. And as I put it like that, can you see the parallel between how we are with our inner life and how we are with others? It's actually the same dynamic, right? So how are we with our own patterns and shadows, if you like, that we may find more difficult? How are we with others in the world? So propaganda can give us a narrowed view of the humanity of others. A narrow view of the humanity of others. People are reduced to a kind of rigid or narrow perception of them. If you think about how racism operates, of course, this is a very painful example of this, but you know, the perception of somebody based on their racial identity it becomes very sort of fixed and narrowed, and we think as soon as we've seen their appearance, we've somehow summed up that person in that description, that identity. And the depth, beauty, complexity of a person is lost in that moment. Yeah. It can happen. I mean, in fact, if you notice, this kind of narrowing of our perceptions happens all the time. I mean, where we used to live, we used to have some quite noisy neighbours. And to be honest with you, I quite often thought about them as just that, the noisy neighbours, right? But you can see it. It's not to deny. I mean, they were noisy, and they did live near us. So there's a sort of relative truth in that. But that wasn't the whole of their being. It wasn't the whole of their being. So when I was feeling, annoyed by that, then that perception narrows, doesn't it? Oh, that lot of doing that again. But you can also have moments of imaginatively opening up your perception. So these are people with hopes and fears. I mean, what for me was noise, for them was music. And I definitely remember in my early years, I would have been one of those noisy neighbours, as someone who loves music and used to like listening to it loud. So you start to kind of have this, it's a little bit less fixed then, isn't it? That lot over there. And then, I can reflect how much I still do love music and how I like music. And so for them, it was bringing them some joy. And it doesn't again eradicate my perspective. Maybe I wanted to, go to sleep or read a book or do some meditation, and it was unwanted for me. So my perspective is included too, of course. But nevertheless, it's slightly less fixed. You see what I mean? It's not less fixed. Oh, that noisy neighbours. So compassion then, is enriching our perception of others rather than impoverishing it. So if propaganda is impoverishing the perception, saying, these people can be summed up in a few words, compassion is how we enrich. I think sometimes of the theologian Martin Buber, who uses this term I thou. It says when you're speaking to another person, it's an I thou relationship, whereas when you're confronted with a sort of physical object, it's an I it relationship. Yeah. So like a book or something, it's something I can use. It has a function, it has a utility, so I can relate to it like that. Do I like it? Do I not like it? But the I-thou relationship, or the relationship we can have with other human beings, is more of a feeling of being open-ended. It can never be, in a beautiful way, you never come to the end of that. It would be a shame, wouldn't it, to say to another person, now I know you completely. I'm not sure that's ever true. Yeah. There's a feeling that there's always more to discover as we attend to another person. So, one of the things that supports compassion then is what I would call a generosity of perception. Yeah, a generosity of perception. Yeah. So again, that's in contrast to the narrow perception, the noisy neighbor, that lot that are causing trouble, the other lot, the people we don't like, the us and them mentality. And the novelist and philosopher Iris Murdoch, she gives a lovely example of what I would see as the generosity of perception. So she describes it like this. She says, a mother feels hostility to her daughter-in-law. She finds her to be a good-hearted girl, but feels that she's unpolished, lacking in refinement, and perhaps a bit common. She's inclined to be pert and familiar, insufficiently ceremonious, brusque, sometimes positively rude, and always tiresomely juvenile. The mother doesn't like her accent or the way she dresses and feels that her son has married beneath him. So I wonder if there's something of the English 1950s in this example, but there it is. But then anyway, Iris Murdoch goes on. She says, however, the mother is an intelligent and well-intentioned person. So she tells herself, I'm old-fashioned and conventional. I may be prejudiced or narrow-minded. I may be snobbish. I'm certainly jealous. Let me look again. And when she does, so she discovers that her daughter-in-law is not vulgar, but refreshingly simple. Not undignified, but spontaneous. Not noisy, but gay. Not tiresomely juvenile, but delightfully youthful, and so on. Can you see, this is the generosity of perception. So the mother-in-law's first perceptions are all looking through the lens, if you like, of, my son has married beneath him. The generosity of perception is to look again, a different way of framing that, a different way of seeing that. I think of this these days with through the idea of coping mechanisms. I find this helpful for a generosity of perception. I don't know if you've had the moments when you with somebody or you see somebody who seems to be looking at their phone all the time. And there might be the thought, oh, why are they doing that? What is it about them that does that? Or you might know somebody that you feel drinks a little too much alcohol. And you say, oh, I don't know why they don't just stop drinking. Or you see somebody who's, I don't know, watching TV all the time and you think, oh, they just slump out in front of the TV. I think they should really do something. I mean, for me, those words have become a little bit of a clue that I've drifted out of a compassionate mode of being. That phrase, why don't they just? Why don't they just? It's easy to feel that about others. Why don't they just put away their phone? Why don't they just do this? And it's very easy to run other people's lives, of course. And I find this idea of coping mechanisms really helpful. That, who knows why somebody looks at their phone a lot? There might be some pain underneath that activity. It's a way of distracting themselves. Maybe they're actually looking at things that we don't know about. I mean, maybe it's actually nourishing for them that's there. Again, or we feel somebody's drinking too much. Again, rather than the attitude of condemnation, we can think, well, what's behind that? What's driving that? What's the pain that's there, or what are they needing, or what's unmet in that person? Can you see again? There's this generosity of perception rather than why don't they just? They should do this. They should do that. But we begin to wonder. And I think this is a clue to compassion. We begin to creatively use our imagination to think, what's it like to be that person? What's going on for them? Less quick to judgment. And this gives us, I think, also a greater what's called a cognitive flexibility by the psychologists. And I love this phrase, that in our tough times, if you might notice, we get cognitively inflexible. When we're stressed, we think in ways that are more narrow, more fixed, more black and white, more all or nothing. But our practice, both the insight practices, the metta practices, compassion practices, we could say are allowing us to see things in more and more different ways, in different perspectives. There's a story from a psychology textbook that has become a kind of koan for me. In koan meaning something I kind of play over again and again in my mind. And it's actually a very simple story, but I find it quite poignant, really. And it's just that there's a person who arranges to go to lunch with a friend, and the friend doesn't turn up. So far, so simple. This person's on their own. And of course, she very understandably feels upset and angry about this because she's been left waiting in the cafe. But so she contacts the friend, and the friend says, I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. You just had so much on and I forgot. And, really appreciate it's not really okay that I didn't come, but I would love to see you. I've just had so much on. Can we make another time? And the person whose friend didn't turn up is so stuck in her perception that this was just rude and disrespectful that actually she finishes the friendship completely. And the person who's apologized tries again 2 or 3 times and says, look, I'll try again in a few days when things have cooled down. But for the other person, that's it. The friendship is finished. And so this would be an example of cognitive inflexibility, right? Being very stuck, very fixed, intransigent. And it's really painful to be in that place, isn't it? It's really painful. And maybe sometimes we can all feel a bit like that. Again, it's not to say that there's that person who was like that. Maybe in certain states of mind, we're all a bit like that. But I think about that example a lot, because then that person loses a friend. And if that person reacts like that every time anything goes wrong, then it's actually very difficult to build sustained relationships and friendships. And friendships are such a support in our lives. They're a joy in themselves and support for all kinds of physical, mental health. So that way of coping with very fixed thinking, very, fixed ways of thinking and behaving is very painful. So if our practice moves us in the opposite direction, and I don't mean to say we'll never get caught in our fixed ways of perceiving or being, but that it's opening up new possibilities to see things in a different way, to view others more generously, to view ourselves more generously. So I also wanted to mention that compassion can also be very strong. So people often wonder whether compassion means, just being sort of nice and soft all the time, and how compassion can also have a very strong expression when things need to be challenged, when harmful things are happening. And again, I found this book by Tara Brach very helpful with an example of this as well. So she calls this newspaper meditation. During the weeks leading up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, led by the United States military, I found myself increasingly agitated. Every day, the news headlines were making it clear where all the talk by politicians was leading. I'd open the newspaper and find myself feeling anger and hostility towards those in government who were beating the drums of war. Just seeing their photos on the front page of the newspapers would set me off. At the same time, my book Radical Acceptance had just come out, and students were asking me how acceptance and activism could go together. How could we radically accept and seek change at the same time? How could we see what was going on and not do something in response? I was increasingly aware that the hostility I was feeling in my own mind was actually another form of violence. And yet I needed to stay engaged. I needed to do something, to take some kind of action. Since I wasn't going to stop reading the newspaper, I decided to make it into a meditation. Each morning, I would open the paper, check out the headlines, read a few paragraphs, and then pause. I'd notice my reactions, the thoughts and feelings of outrage. I'd allow the experience to move in my mind and body, not denying or feeding it, just witnessing the response I was having to the latest reports. I began to see that when I opened to the full force of the anger I was feeling, I could sense within it fear for our world. And so I opened to the fear. It unfolded into grief for the suffering and devastation that was inevitable in war. And out of the grief arose a deep caring for all the beings, humans and animals and trees, that would be harmed by the violence we were moving toward. And she goes on, after a number of newspaper meditation sessions, I had the opportunity to join others in Washington, D.C. to protest the war. We were peacefully arrested, along with clergy of all denominations, Nobel laureates and elders, all of us expressing our caring for everyone directly affected by the war, soldiers and families, Iraqis and Americans alike. We held with compassion the enormous suffering we knew would come. We held peace rather than violence in our hearts. So, yeah, I think this is a very beautiful description of her process with that. And yeah, very powerful teaching, really, very powerful teaching. Just wanted to reflect on it a little bit more to draw out some of the points that really speak to me. So on the one hand, she wasn't just reading more and more and more news in a kind of mindless way, just sort of taking it in and getting in a state of overwhelm that, just sort of left her feeling unable to cope. But interestingly, she also didn't switch it off entirely, right? She says, I'm not going to stop reading the newspaper. So she's there present and turning that into a meditation. So she's there, really aware of what it brings up, the thoughts, the feelings, giving that some space. I mean, I've watched a lot of news in my life, but I think, quite often I haven't done that. You're hearing all these things, you're taking in all this information. But where's the space also then to absorb, to be with that? I mean, the very emotionally evocative things we're seeing, hearing, reading about. So some space to absorb, to process. And as she does that, she describes a journey, really, I would say, from anger and hostility through sadness and grief to compassion. So again, this is not in a way making the anger wrong, is it? It's not saying that anger was just something that shouldn't have been there. It was a clue that something wasn't okay. That's what anger does, right? It tells us that something important is being threatened. But rather than staying with that at its rawest form, if you like, there's like a kind of, I don't know what the word is, digesting or processing. Okay, underneath the anger, there's the grief, there's the sadness. And then again, if you notice, out of all of that also comes action. So she's not stuck in a passivity with that, but goes on this protest. Notice also about the story, she doesn't do that on her own. Sometimes when we think of compassion for the sufferings in the world, I mean, it can feel so overwhelming sometimes, that feeling of what can I do about it, little me, Whereas this feeling of joining with others, going through this process that she describes, finding a way to creatively respond. And of course, and we know in this case, it didn't stop the war. But who knows what effect it had? Who knows what effect it had? And that effect will continue to have. Because the fact that she went through that whole process and then wrote about it in a book, then I read it. I was touched by that. I'm now sharing it with you. Can you see the ripple effects of this? So sometimes when we think, what effect did something have? Again, it's really worth wondering, well, maybe the effect is not, within the half hour, but the effect might be rippling out. So there's also something about compassion that is beautifully endless. And what I mean by that is, we never finish. It's not like a job that you start has a middle and an end, right? I'm going to be compassionate. So, okay, I'll start at 12 o'clock. I'll get busy being compassionate. By 1 o'clock, it's finished. I mean, it's not like that, is it? It's a lifelong thing. And when we're thinking of, how compassion relates to our own hearts and minds, how it relates to how we are with our families, in our, romantic relationships, if we're in those, how it relates to our communities, how it relates to, all of the challenges in the world around us that we're so conscious of. These aren't things that we can tick off and get done. And in the Buddhist tradition, what are called the Bodhisattva vows, I think really speak to this. In the Mahayana tradition, the Bodhisattva vows are taken and they say, though the many beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Though greed, hatred, and ignorance rise endlessly, I vow to end them. Though the path is vast and fathomless, I vow to understand it. Though enlightenment is beyond attainment, I vow to embody it fully. Yeah. So this feeling of something, vowing to do something that has no end. And if it has no end, it's also timeless, which means it's also always here and now. And it all sounds a bit strange, but strange things happen with time like that, right? It's not a task that we complete and tick off, but something that can inform and shape our whole life. And that means every moment, it brings us right back to the now. How do we embody that here and now? Because we can never quite be sure what the outcomes of our actions are. In the yoga traditions, the Hindu traditions, the Bhagavad Gita, it teaches this. It teaches what's called karma yoga, which means to act with a sense of selfless service, without attachment to result, without attachment to outcome. And I think this is really, again, the spirit of compassion. So maybe to go from the vast sense of the Bodhisattva vows to come right back down to earth and in everyday language, I think what it means is we do our best. We do our best in each moment to embody these qualities and bring them into, the challenges we face personally and collectively.